joy of journeying further into the Bible. And from what I understand, you started out in September in Genesis, and now you've moved forward, further, and lo and behold, we are with Esther this week. Now, our reading, I have to confess, it probably maybe only made a little bit of sense to you in just hearing that small chunk, because we jumped into it in the middle of chapter 4, and the fact is that there's just a lot of really cool stuff that happens in this story of Esther prior to where we jumped in. Esther is one of the coolest little nuggets from the Old Testament, because it has this great heroine, this great female leader who has just this different background than anyone before. So to set the stage for you a little bit, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what happened to get us to where we are in our reading. So by this point in history, the Jewish people had been freed from exile, but they were still pretty spread out throughout the area. And Esther, where she was, they were under the rule of the Babylonians, and then the Persians came in and wiped the Babylonians out, so they had this new Persian king. And when you read about this Persian king, you read about him, and the impression that we get right away from the beginning of Esther is that Persians like to party. Because he sets up this big festival. And it goes on for a long time. And he said the grand finale of this festival is going to be a 7-day-long party. And it's going to be lavish, and there's going to be decorations, and we're going to pull out the blue and the purple fabrics, which were really expensive at that time because that was expensive dye. And there will be wine, lots and lots of wine. And so this party goes on for 7 days, and at the end, on the 7th day, the text says, if you look in the Bible, the text says that this king was feeling pretty merry by that point. Think about it, 7 days of wine. So he decides that he is going to call upon his beautiful wife, because every good Persian king has a beautiful wife that they need to parade around. So he calls upon her because he wants to show everyone what a wonderful, pretty wife he has. But alas, he calls upon her. Her name was Vashti. And she's not there. She's missing. Because it turns out she had kind of gotten fed up with this whole my husband's going to parade me around thing, and she just got out of town. And oh no, we have a Persian king who is left without a beautiful queen. And everyone knows that every Persian king has to have a beautiful queen. And so he orders the collection of all these women. And he says, I'm going to find myself another beautiful queen. If Vashti's going to leave, I'm going to find myself a new one. And so he gathers all these people, and they're given a long time to prepare for it, these women are. And then he calls them in one by one to figure out who will be his next wife. And Esther is one of those women. Now, I mentioned before that the exile had been lifted, and there was still Jewish people spread all around. And they were by no means within the majority of this group. The Jewish people were still within the minority. And so Esther is in this collection of women about to meet this Persian king. And before she goes in, she has a wonderful cousin named Mordecai. Now, basically, Mordecai raised Esther. And so before Esther goes in to meet the king, Mordecai says, hey, maybe keep your Jewish identity on the down low, because we just don't know what this king is going to do. we're not the most popular people. And so she keeps it quiet. And she goes in and she meets the king, and it is love at first sight. And he decides that this beautiful woman named Esther, who is calm in demeanor, and she doesn't try to show off at all, he decides that that's who he wants as his wife. And so it is. Now think about that. Esther, who was part of the minority group, kept her identity quiet, still quiet, and all of a sudden, she's royalty. That's a fairy tale, kind of. But it kind of gets a little scary after that. Because what happens is Mordecai, really nice guy, really good caretaker, family member. He goes to the gates of where Esther lives every day, and he sends messages through the eunuch to check on her, just to make sure she's okay. And so while he's out there waiting to send his message one day, he overhears that these two guards are planning to assassinate the king. And he overhears it, and being the nice guy that Mordecai is, he sends a message into Esther and says, hey, just a heads up, there's some people out here who are planning to get away or to do away with your husband. Just thought you might like to know, right? And so what happens is the king then wipes out those guards, wipes out a lot of guards, and then he puts into this place this guy named Haman. And he's like the new head guard. He's kind of a big deal. And he's kind of not the nicest person either. And so he insists that everyone who is at those gates, everyone who works within the palace, bows down to him. And Mordecai, who's at that gate every day, refuses to do it. And this makes Haman mad, like really mad. And so he decides that he's just going to get rid of Mordecai. And not only is he going to get rid of Mordecai, but he's going to get rid of all the Jewish people. Because he didn't want them to follow suit and not bow down to him. So, okay, we'll just get rid of all of them. So he does this thing where he manipulates the king into sending out a written decree telling the date of when this is going to happen. Can you imagine that? Getting a written decree come into your mailbox telling you on this day you are going to be wiped out. Talk to you later. Probably didn't say that, but. So naturally, Mordecai and the Jewish people are thrust into this state of deep despair and deep mourning because their days are numbered. And this is where we jump into today's story. We jump into the story of Mordecai being at the gate and sending messages to Esther saying, here's what's going to happen. Did you know this? And it turns out Queen Esther and the king didn't know this. And so she comes back with, I didn't know this. And Mordecai says, yeah, this is happening. And he goes, you should probably maybe use your position of privilege, your place in the royal house to do something. And Esther, as you read, her initial reaction is, no, thanks. Because in order to go talk to the king, you have to be called upon. And Esther hadn't herself, as his queen, his fine queen, hadn't been called on for the last 30 days. And so if she were to just barge in and tell the king that he needs to stop this genocide of the Jews, then she herself could have been killed. And that was a pretty significant risk. And then Mordecai sends another message to her. And he says this. He says, "Perhaps you've come to the royal city, to dignity, for a time such as this." For a time such as this. A time when darkness and despair has creeped into our world and we are left in a place of very little hope. A time when our system and our place that we are living in has come down on us. We need your place within the royal house. We need you to speak for us for such a time as this. Esther's story is an Advent story. Esther's story is a time when we find ourselves in the season of waiting. A season when darkness has literally crept into our world. Like, have you noticed that the sun sets at 4 o'clock? There's darkness, and it long wraps us in. And there's darkness that divides our communities, divides us as God's people. And we're left to wait. We're left to figure out, where is our light going to come from? Where's our hope going to come from? Esther's story is an Advent story. What's interesting about Esther's story when you read it, which I hope you all go to read it, because I'm not telling you the rest of it or how it ends. What you'll find is at no point does God directly step into this story. What happens is we have this story of Esther and Haman and the king and Mordecai, and they're all just kind of figuring out what to do. Sometimes that kind of feels like us. We know that God is working here somewhere. And I don't know about any of you, but I guess I haven't had a burning bush come before me recently. Like, that's usually God's style in the Old Testament, but that doesn't happen in the story of Esther. God is working through God's people. And so as we stand in this time of darkness and waiting, it brings us into a time of hope. Brings us into a time of wondering, where is God working through the people around me? And it brings us into a time of questioning, how is God working through me? How is God working through you? How is God working through this community? To be part of dwelling in the darkness. To be part of God's work to bring light to the world. To be part of restoring the community. So that God's people will be able to flourish in God's love and grace. So may you wait. May you wait at the gates with Mordecai to see what happens next. May you wait with our communities as we stand in what at times feels like a very dark place. May you wait with peace and hope that the light is coming. Amen.